The coast is valued for its beauty and drama, for its historic role for a seagoing nation, as a place of nature, of rocks, plants and seabirds, and a place of culture, of livelihood, recreation and artistic inspiration. The coast is more than a line between sea and land. It's a rich landscape, both on the ground and in our mind. Wherever we live, the coast is part of our emotional life, stirring the imagination. While the coast is strongly tied to the sense of an island nation, it also reminds us of our place in a wider world of environmental change. Shores are always shifting, sometimes slowly and imperceptibly, but we are now witnessing more dramatic changes tied to rising global sea levels and mankind's tireless efforts to defend land from the sea. The arts and humanities have a key role to play in understanding environmental change through their focus on landscape and culture and imagination. With such a rich history between people and the sea, what stories do we tell of coastal change? During this film, we'll visit 3 sites around England that showcase creative engagements with coastal change, that embrace, perform and picture change and bring these places to life. The first stop on my coastal tour brings me to a beautiful corner of Cornwall to learn about an experimental narration of the history of the much-loved Mullion Harbour on the Lizard Peninsula. I'm here to speak to DeSilvey, a senior lecturer in cultural geography at the University of Exeter.
Well, Mullion Harbour was built in 1895. At that time there was an active pilchard fishing fleet here. And in 1945 it was offered to the National Trust in a pretty sorry state. There is a paradox here because the National Trust to many people is about preserving these places forever. And in this site anyway, forever isn't going to work. They've started to understand that actually holding the line against coastal change isn't going to be viable for them in the long term.
So tell me what you yourself do here to try and communicate different kinds of history, different kinds of scenarios.
The project that I've been doing here specifically was really about the writing of it. So it was about a narrative, writing a reverse chronology of this site, which I then imagined as a kind of anticipatory history. So how you might take the history of this site and then project it forward. I think of anticipatory history as being a very porous medium. But then what resources do people need to try to imagine how that change in the harbour might affect them in the future, how they might live in this place with the harbour walls gone? I mean, one idea that I like playing with is the idea of palliative curation, that a building actually has a life cycle, and when it's ready to die, you can attentively and sort of actively watch it and care for it in its final moments, but not try to pull it back from the brink.
How are we going to get this message across that's not going to be environmental change is doom and gloom, but just get them to engage with things?
I'm doing another project where we're experimenting with using locative media so that you could come to a place like Mullion and download images showing the gradual destruction and reconstruction of the harbour. And so I think telling a story that helps people see some of that or visualize and imagine some of those processes might help them think about the story that then continues on to the harbour's eventual deconstruction.
How can we tell this story to other people concerned with environmental change, for example, physical scientists?
Well, in telling the story at Mullion, I actually worked quite closely with geologists and physical geographers who told me about things like the way that rocky coasts behave, and we're actually standing above a geological fault here. And I think the key thing is that people don't understand the past or the future through looking at charts about anticipated sea level rise or through reading a report. They need to understand how that's going to affect them intimately. And for people who live in Mullion, their family histories, the histories of fishing out of this cove, those are folded into the story that I wrote.
So people are going to learn a lot from your work. What have you learned here?
I guess what I learned was that there's something that needs to happen in the way we perceive these places, and that you almost need to give people who are in the position of making those decisions the tools to think about letting go as not all about loss, but actually as something that can be sort of creative, can be constructive, can be part of other patterns of change at a site. So it's not about preservation, but it's about engaging with the history of the places that they care for in different ways.
So what have we learned at Mullion Harbour? We've learned that change is coming, we've learned the sea is going to take the wall away, that the harbour is going to be a ruin. But this needn't be a story of loss. If we tell the story differently, we can think about this change imaginatively and creatively. We can embrace change. My second stop lacks Mullion Harbour's scenic heritage and lies some distance from the well-trodden tourist trail.
A land reclaimed over many years, farmed intensively, especially since the 1950s, last embanked in 1956, strength and resolve, strengthened and resolved.
In North Lincolnshire, in a land that was fertilised by warp, alluvial soil deposited by flooding, performance artist Mike Pearson has created a sound work to reflect the process of coastal change.
I remember coming here in my youth, bird watching, large numbers of waterfowl in winter, ducks, geese, but really a very, very isolated place, deserted landscape. Very, very rarely saw other people here. And I guess in one way that was one of the reasons that it was chosen to give back, to experiment with this technique of letting go.
So it was a waterland, was reclaimed and will again be a waterland?
Exactly. Here to my right, this is the site of one of the first major realignment schemes in Britain, where basically a hole has been made in the riverbank, and at high tide the Humber can flood this area here. So it's created this completely new wetland in an area that was an agricultural landscape.
So tell me, Mike, how do you go about making a performance work here?
The works that I've been doing in this landscape have been in collaboration with the composer John Hardy. In 2006, we made the Carlands project, which is a three-hour audio work. It's available on the web, you can download it, and basically audiences can take it to a landscape in North Lincolnshire, and basically they can walk the landscape listening to this work.
It will take another 100 years and steam pumping to make this landscape as it is. And something else, letting it back in. Warping, Anglo-Saxon, warpan, to turn aside.
Mike, tell me about the value of performance work for public understanding of environmental projects like this.
Well, I think the value for public understanding is that it can bring these landscapes to an audience. So it allows you to include data, scientific thinking within the text of performance itself. I've really learned so much over the last few years through being here, accompanied by geographers, accompanied by archaeologists, and always to ask, what are you seeing here? How do you look here? And trying to take that into performance. So I think there's a kind of convergence of interest, and it's there where the discussions can happen, and then where particular kinds of thinking can be transferred into performance and can find its articulation.
This place at Alkborough appears a landscape that is flat, featureless and still. But what we've learned is that it has a highly dynamic history of environmental change. The people of this place have for centuries been involved in building this land up and letting it go. They have, in a sense, been performing change. And performance, as a creative medium, is a way of helping us understand these changes with all their uncertainties. It is a way of bringing this landscape to life. My final stop is on the Deben estuary in Suffolk, and I'm about to meet visual artist Simon Reed, whose work helps local communities imagine what the future holds for Suffolk's changing coast. Since 1980, Simon has lived on a sea-going Dutch barge, which means that he is much more attuned to coastal change than most people. Simon's work brings to life the consequences of potentially radical changes suggested by shoreline management plans, helping to take community interests and cultural memories forward into the future flood risk management policy.
I've taken all of the information from the Environment Agency material relating to the shoreline management plan, the chart material going back into the last century, and also the contemporary chart material, OS material, and I've tried to put the whole lot together and to speculate as much as possible on the drivers for change actually at the entrance to our river. Basically, this is the entrance to the river. This line here is the current line of the coast. It projects into 2125, and this is actually how I imagine that line being. I started doing it purely as a tool for putting in any kind of changes which might happen, and as a way of explaining the changes.
So it's a kind of working progress.
It's a work in progress.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it's getting to the point at the end of it's natural soon, because as I put things on, so other bits are beginning to crumble and fall off again. But
other bits of the landscape.
Yeah.
You know all of these through navigation, do you?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I feel I'm really quite grounded, not only on this river, but on the East Coast. So you do know all the deep parts, because you want to know where you can anchor without going aground on the tide.
Right.
This one here is the interesting one. This is the LiDAR map. LiDAR basically is, I think it's a combination of laser and radar. The drained farmland is far, far lower. It's about 1.5 meters lower than the land outside, which means that there are issues to do with drainage. One of the hats I wear is salt marsh management, and the problem is that the channel here, going between the river wall and the salt marsh, is widened and also created subsidiary sort of ponds, to the point where probably where the salt marsh is draining out to the river is beginning to meet the working inner here, and at which point it'll start, the whole salt marsh structure will start disintegrating. The systems we operate in now are very, very data-led, which means that the language which is used is very, very arcane to the general person. Maps for me was a mechanism to explain how change was happening and how the foreseeable future could look. The way in which it operates is actually to open up a conversation, which then I would hope the people I'm working with would pick up and run with. My sort of mantra always is that, can I get it down onto a single sheet of paper? There is a very strong case to be made for the place that imagination has in terms of selecting and exploring information in a much more pictorial form.
At Mullion, we learned that the harbour is a transient place, and the next time big storms hit, fewer repairs will be made, and eventually the harbour will be let go to the sea. At Alkborough, the sea defences have already been breached artificially to let the water in once again to create a wetland rich in wildlife. Finally, at the Deben estuary, we explored the consequences of predicted coastal changes by looking at maps which picture coastal scenarios. The stories we tell about these landscapes remind us of our place in the wider world, linking our understanding of the past with our lives in the present and our plans for the future.
Narrating, performing, picturing. We've seen 3 different creative engagements with environmental change in different coastal landscapes. We've learnt that the imagination matters as a way of understanding environmental change. These perspectives can combine constructively with the insights of science, the demands of policy, and the interests of people. Creative conversations to reach a wider world.